This is TWiT.
It's now more than ever that we ensure our data is private because, especially with the pandemic going on and the pandemic response data. Curtis, you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, to show how important data privacy is, yesterday, January 28th, was Data Privacy Day 2021. And it is all focused on helping people understand what their rights are regarding privacy and what their responsibilities are to ensure that privacy. There is globally a huge variation in what privacy means and how privacy is enforced online. You have nations and nation states where it is a high priority. Places like Europe, with its very prominent and commonly talked about GDPR regulations. Then you have places like the United States, where your data, your personal data, is viewed as a fungible thing that you can sell by. And the thing is, you don't have to really be made aware of when you are swapping that privacy for something. And let's be really honest, the penalties against individuals and companies that abuse that privacy are very small. So we have looked at what privacy means, and one of the key concepts that's been in the business world but is becoming something that more consumers are becoming aware of is the notion of zero trust. Now, this has been around for a decade or so in the security world, and basically it means that at every transaction and at every step in the transaction, you have to explicitly grant permission for data to flow. You don't say, I granted permission to use one example, Facebook, and therefore I'm cool with whatever they do with my data and whatever any of their clients or customers do with my data. Zero trust means that you have to say yes or no every time. So it's interesting to watch because many people confuse privacy and security. They're related, but very different. And that difference is critical. Lou, I want to ask you, when you are talking to people about privacy, do you find that they frequently come to you with concepts from security that have little to do with privacy? Or do you think that most people have a pretty good idea of what the terms mean?
I think you're 100% correct. I think they always get confused. It doesn't matter if I'm talking with small or medium-sized businesses or even enterprises. Sometimes they get it wrong. And it's usually around storage. Like, where's my data being stored? They get confused on how it's being locked and keyed away, how it's being secured versus who's able to see it, who's able to interact with it, is it being, distributed amongst more than one source that I don't know about. And I think that's one of the big things that organizations need to pay attention to, obviously, especially when they're storing things in the cloud, for sure, is that they're making sure that the data is not only secured in a way with the quote unquote zero trust model where it's isolated away and only you have access to it or only the people that need to have access to it. But in the same sense, it's put in a place where other services can't interact with it, or it can't be sent somewhere, or if it's stored in a public place and they do analytics on it, are they removing the PII or, with GDPR, do I know it's there and can it be removed? And so, these are very complex things. And sometimes it requires, privacy and consultants to come in and say, you have a complex setup and you deal with different clientele for different parts of the market. Here's how you need to make sure things are flowing and being stored and so on. And so it becomes in its own market. It basically becomes its own market. And I think that's a challenging thing for any organization. But you're right. Like, I think they do sometimes get that wrong and don't really understand the differences between those two, and that you're going to need, consulting sometimes as well as, higher level systems to support them both.
Very true. And one of the things that we have to remember from the enterprise perspective and from the business perspective is that many times your responsibilities when it comes to privacy deal not with the size of your business, but with the reach of your customer base. It's very easy in these times for a very small business to have an entirely international client base. And that means in many cases that customer's data is subject to the regulations and laws of the place where they live, not the place where you do business. So it can be critical to keep up with privacy. And what I think we're going to see more and more is a situation where the default is to ask for explicit permission, to limit the permissions you seek, and then where you limit the data you store in response to those limited permissions. The easiest thing in the world is just not to store data that you don't want to pay to protect. And that's a good lesson on this day after Data Privacy Day 2021.